right, ladies. It's time to rein it back in and get going. Again, a discussion at our table was riveting as it is drama, 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 right? And it doesn't even stop. Like, it just keeps going, and it's just like, what is going to happen now? And you're just like at the edge of your seat, like, I can't believe they did that. Anybody else reading it and just like, are you kidding me? Like, telling that to yourself. That's how I was like the whole entire time. Because sometimes we can get caught up in just, oh, it's just a Bible story and just recite the facts and kind of thing. But when you actually see these characters as people and like what they were thinking and how they were reacting, almost feeling their emotions, and you read the stories again, it's just like, oh my word, are you serious? Anybody else? Yes, thank you. Thank you. So we're coming off of the first part of 2 Samuel, David's rise to power, and again, just the drama that unfolds between Ishbosheth's general. Remember, Ishbosheth is the king of Israel at the time. David gets crowned king in Judah, and his general Joab, and how just the jealousy that takes place, the unnecessary fighting and people that were killed. Ishbosheth's crown jewel was Abner, his general, who actually kept him in power probably for that 7 years. And then Ishbosheth gets a little bit jealous and accuses Abner of sleeping with one of his concubines, which is a huge no-no. And Abner's like, you know what? I'm done. You're not good enough. I'm going to go to David's side. So as he's defecting to David, and David's welcoming him with open arms, as David typically does, because he's a very generous guy, Joab, his general, was like, really? You're letting this guy on your side? He is our enemy. Not only that, but Abner also killed Joab's brother, so he had revenge in his heart. So while Abner's trying to defect to David, Joab kills him. Very sad, very murderous. But God still uses that to pave the way for David to rise into power, as a little bit later Ishbosheth is assassinated and David is able to take the throne over all of Israel, thus solidifying and unifying one whole nation. And we see it over and over again. David turns to the Lord. God, what do you want me to do here? How do you want me to fight this battle? Where do you want me to go? And David answers him, and he goes before him, and he conquers all these nations, drives out the Philistines, subdues the nations around him, the Edomites, the Moabites. And David's doing pretty good. He's got his nice house in there. He's had his covenant with God. His kingship is secure forever. And now the story will take a turn. Instead of focusing on David, we're going to focus on his children. And we learn very quickly that his children are not very well behaved. And the failure of David to chastise or discipline his children leads to rape, murder, rebellion, and heartache. But as God is so good, through all of that, he will reign supreme, and he is still faithful to preserve David and then raise up Solomon as the next king. Fun fact, this is a little bit in the weeds, but I had something that I had to kind of look up. How many wives did David had? To be technical, we don't actually know. It just says he took more wives, but there are 8 wives that was actually mentioned by name, and an unknown number of concubines from the surrounding area. Again, we don't know if these were political or David was just feeding his lust or anything like that. There are 21 children that were mentioned in the book of Samuel, and that includes the newborn son born to David and Bathsheba that died. So there could have been many, many more children. We just don't know because they're not mentioned in the Bible. So that was just kind of a fun fact where David was in that. And it was kind of like a big thing, like, why did God allow him to have so many wives? Like, why is this a thing? But we do see that kind of sets the precedence for Solomon later on, who took David's sins and magnified them, and that led to his downfall, which we will read about when we get to 1 Kings. So let's go back to his children. We start off with Amnon. Now, this is David's firstborn. He was born in Hebron before David took control over all of Israel. And he was probably the crown prince, next in line after David being the oldest. And this story begins with him lusting after his half-sister Tamar, who was the full sister of Absalom, and luring her into his quarters and then raping her. His lust turned to hate, and then he made the incest look like it was even her fault, putting more shame and guilt on her head instead of taking ownership for it. David, though he was angry with Amnon, but he really didn't do anything about it. He failed to discipline him. And it could have been because Amnon was next in line to be king and David really didn't want to cross him. It could have been that since David was also guilty of sexual sin with Bathsheba, he didn't really feel like he had a leg to stand on. Or it could be that while David was unsurpassed as a king and a military leader, he lacked wisdom as a husband and a father. Now, 2 years goes by, and it feels like, things have kind of settled down, but Absalom, Tamar's full brother, still harbors hatred towards Amnon in his heart. So he takes revenge by inviting all the king's sons to his house for this really big party, making it seem really innocent, and he has Amnon killed. And after that, he flees to escape the punishment because he knows he's done wrong. He knows he's murdered the king's son. But by killing Amnon, Absalom also got his revenge. But he also set himself up to be most likely the next king by getting rid of the crown prince. So, and again, David was too preoccupied with government affairs, his wives, his concubines, to discipline and train his children well. And after half-heartedly correcting Amnon, he didn't even deal decisively with Absalom's murder of Amnon. Such indecisiveness became David's own doing in the end. Just like us, when we ignore sin or make excuses for ourselves, oh, that's just how they are. They're not going to change. I don't need to call that out. Let's just sweep it under the rug because it's easy to ignore it than to actually deal with it. But every time we do, it grows, becomes more ugly, and the consequences are usually greater and way more painful than we ever anticipated. Eventually, David does bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. And during that time, even though David doesn't really see Absalom, Absalom starts setting himself up as a leader among the people. When people would come into Jerusalem, asking David for a judgment on something, Absalom would take him aside and be like, let me help you with this. Let me do this for you. And so he began to win the favor of the people and start to create a following as he was setting himself up as king. Eventually, this leads to an outright rebellion, enough that David was fearing for his life and had to leave Jerusalem. And there's a lot of drama that goes on with that, people cursing David on his way. And he even insults his father even more by sleeping with his father's concubines in full view of everybody in the city. A father's mistakes are often reflected in the lives of his children. And Absalom's bitter replay and amplification of David's past sins, God had predicted that David's family would suffer because of his sins against Bathsheba and Uriah. But David's heart was broken when he realized that God's predictions were coming true. God forgave David, but he didn't cancel the consequences. David was horrified when he saw his son's strengths run wild without the controls that God had built into his own life. Absalom might have been a good king, but he lacked personal integrity, he lacked self-control, and it ultimately led to his ruin. After Absalom's rebellion was squashed, there was another revolt from the man named Sheba. Now, at that time, even though it was technically a united kingdom, it was still made up of 12 separate tribes that were still kind of at odds with each other, and there was jealousy that went back even to the time of Joshua as they were taking over the land of Canaan. And so this jealousy came up with Sheba and again threatened David's reign as he gained another following and started to threaten David's reign. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he sought to dethrone David as well. Thankfully, again, God preserved David's line, and that rebellion was squashed very quickly. As it moved on from there, we go to more stories of David's kingship. And again, this isn't necessarily in order. It could have been from way back before he was king to the time that he was running from Saul all the way through. It just kind of lumps them all in one little section. So it talks about his victories. It talks about his mighty men, the people that were able to serve David, that God raised up to help him win the battles. The emphasis, though, falls on David's praise for God and his sovereignty and his mercies throughout the battles, the mighty warriors that God uses in service to the king. There are stories of famine, pestilence that resulted from Israel's sins, but they were also reminders that even no king is above the word of the Lord. The book ends by David sinning again, his pride getting the better of him, and he wants to see how great and mighty his army is, so he takes a census. His pride and ambition in counting the people so that he would glory in the size of his army, its power, and its defenses. But by doing this, he put faith in the size of his army rather than faith in God's ability to protect them, regardless of their number. So again, God has to confront David with his sin. But thankfully, again, David repents. But as always, there's still consequences to our sin, whether there's forgiveness or not. We still have to pay the price. But this time, David gets to choose his discipline, and it's devastating to Israel. If we go back and look at the 3 R's, which should be always in the forefront of your mind. And I didn't spell those out for you. You're going to have to find them themselves. I will talk about it a little bit. But the 3 R's that we know are revelation of God to man, how he shows himself to his people; rebellion, how man messes it up or how we stray away from God; and then redemption, how God brings everything back and heals. Okay, so revelation, God reveals himself many different ways. He reveals himself directly to David, showing him what to do. He establishes his throne. We see God's sovereignty in even the most unlikely circumstances and even sinful people to accomplish his will. We see him in his covenant with David to establish David's throne forever and then fulfilled later by Jesus as the King of Kings. We learn that God is sovereign in carrying out his kingdom plans. His unconditional covenant with the undeserving David is as magnificent as his covenant with Abraham. 2 Samuel also says a great deal about how to approach God in worship. And he desires the worship of his people, not because he needs our worship, because he's full of himself, but because when we worship him, we keep our eyes on what is truly important. When we don't worship and take the time to honor God in everything we do, our eyes stray and we worship other things. And when we worship other things, sin comes and then consequences. And God desperately wants to keep us from those consequences. Next, we see rebellion. Lots of rebellion. Some of the main parts are David's adultery and murder of Uriah, his pride in his senses, his failure to discipline his sons, his children making horrific and selfish mistakes over and over again. But the redemption part and the good news is that God does preserve David and his family line. God uses David to unite the kingdom, to demonstrate repentance, and to establish the covenant with David and the promise of a future perfect king. As we see Jesus in 2 Samuel, David is the founder of the dynasty of which Jesus, the son of David, we know is the eternal king. David illustrates Christ's kingship in many ways. First, as a lowly shepherd to guide and lead his people, but also his compassion and loyalty to those who are outcast and despised, like Mephibosheth, was one of the wonderful examples of undeserved love that we ourselves receive from God. In summary, the book of 2 Samuel describes David's reign. Since the Israelites first entered the promised land under Joshua, they had been struggling to unite the nation and drive out the wicked inhabitants. Now, after more than 400 years, Israel was finally at peace. David accomplished what no other leader, judge, or king had been able to do before him. His administration was run on the principle of dedication to God and well-being for the people, yet David, being human, also sinned. Despite recognizing it and confessed his sins to God, David is called a man after God's own heart, because when he sinned, he repented. David committed his life to God and remained loyal to him throughout his lifetime. As we look ahead into 1 Kings coming up next week, we're going to see the transfer of power from David to Solomon, how Solomon started out really, really well and is known for his wisdom and great success, but then the nation quickly falls apart when Solomon's heart is turned aside by his many wives and concubines, and then eventually split in two, with 10 tribes to the north and 2 tribes to the south. And then throughout Kings, we see a record of the reigns of very corrupt and adulterous kings, with only the clear voice of the prophets that will bring the nation back to God. So that's what we have to look forward to in 1 Kings. But this week, while you're reading, pay attention again to the characters, see how the consequences and their actions play out. What have you learned about sin and its consequences? What sins are you overlooking that you should deal with? Why does God allow consequences, even after forgiveness? But give special attention to David's relationship with God. What does David say about God even after being disciplined by him? And then why, even after all of David's mistakes, do you think God still refers to him after a man after God's own heart? And finally, personal reflection. What would it take for you to be called a woman after God's own heart? In conclusion, even though David loved and followed God, his life was full of trouble. There were lots of highs and lots of lows. His troubles were a result of his own sins. Some of them were the result of the sins of others. We can't always control our ups and downs. Life happens. This world, there is trouble. We cannot avoid it. But we can make our choice to trust and choose God every single day. And we can be certain that he will help us through our trials, just like he helped David. And in the end, we win. We'll be rewarded for our faithfulness and our faith. Thank you.